So I give the floor to Paige-san. Thank you.
And thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I'm sure I don't need to convince all of you that technology and autonomous technology in particular are central to the future of the maritime industry, and as such are central to the UK government vision for the UK maritime sector. The UK is committed to supporting industry to deliver on that vision, both in the short term and looking ahead to longer term goals. Like all seafaring vessels, their safety is critical to their success. And I am confident to say that the UK is at the forefront of this. And today I'm here to share with you some of the UK's regulatory developments with regards to autonomous vessels, their safety and their role in search and rescue. Next slide, please. The UK's international journey in relation to autonomous vessels began in the early 2010s and resulted in the UK co-sponsoring a paper in 2015, which was the precursor to the regulatory scoping exercise at the International Maritime Organization. Since then, the UK has continued to work through the IMO on the development of the international framework. As you can see from this slide, the work has included the regulatory scoping exercises of the Maritime Safety Committee, which were completed in 2021, and similar exercises undertaken by the legal and facilitation committees, which was finalised last year. Next slide, please. There are others at this event who have or will go through in more detail the scoping exercise, but on the screen is the breakdown of the main areas identified for further consideration. And although based on a review of the international conventions, these themes have also been identified as essential by the UK as being essential for UK legislation and have formed key considerations when developing a UK regulatory framework. This is important because there is a need for national and international frameworks to move hand in hand when it comes to maritime autonomy in order for the support to be given and for their worldwide implementation. All the points outlined in the table have formed a part of our national conversation on how to regulate MASS in the UK. Next slide, please. Domestic legislation can be driven by international conventions. Equally, international instruments are driven by the input from national administrations. And as an administration, the UK has taken a key role in the discussions at the IMO and the development of the MASS code. The timelines for the development of the code are challenging, but as can be seen on the slide, the IMO and its members are clearly committed to the development of the safe and secure autonomous vessels. The UK's autonomy team, like you here, are dedicated to ensuring that MASS are constructed and operated safely. And as such, we have taken an active role within my IMO discussions, reasoning for a practical yet effective framework on which national legislation can be built. Next slide, please. The timeline on screen shows that the development of the IMO's non-mandatory and mandatory codes have been given challenging timeframes. This reflects the vision within the IMO for MASS to be integrated and to reach a business as usual state. It is the business as usual state and business as usual approach to autonomous vessels that the UK is aiming to achieve. This journey towards the business as usual state is not an easy one, especially when dealing with new, fast-paced and innovative technologies that can often move more quickly than the machinery of government. I'll confess now that keeping up has and will continue to be a challenge. But it is this challenge that has led to a goal-based rather than a prescriptive approach to the assessment of MASS and autonomous technologies in the UK. Next slide, please. The complexities of the UK maritime legislative framework means that the regulation of autonomous vessels is governed by a number of different acts of Parliament, including not only the Merchant Shipping Act, but those highlighted on the screen. In the UK, Acts of Parliament are the primary legislation that provides the legislators with the powers to develop specific instruments and regulations. If a power to regulate is not included within an act, then regulators have limited or no ability to create the regulations that make up a legislative framework. And as was highlighted through the regulatory scoping exercises, there are a number of areas where autonomous vessels and their operations fall outside the powers provided in the acts that the Department of Transport would normally rely on to apply legislation. To rectify this, we've been working on the development of a new piece of primary legislation, for a range of modes of transport that will ensure that the sector can take advantage of technological developments, which includes powers that will allow for the comprehensive regulation of autonomous vessels. The new primary legislation will provide the powers to ensure that autonomous vessels can operate safely and securely within an appropriate framework within the UK, but also ensure that the powers exist to regulate future developments in autonomy. This work will enable the UK to not only regulate MASS, but also support the industry as it continues to grow. This work is ongoing, but until the bill is laid in Parliament and provides new power and the new powers apply, the UK will continue to apply the existing framework to support industry. This includes the use of exemptions and equivalencies supported by Marine Guidance Note MGN 664 and updating the workboat code for vessels under 24 metres, which will include an annex on remotely operated unmanned vessels, ROUVs. As I've mentioned, regulating autonomous vessels and ensuring that they are safe and secure in UK's waters has been challenging. Bound by what we as a regulator can legally allow and support, the relationship between innovators and the MCA was in the early days difficult, as the balance between safety, innovation and the unknown can be difficult to get right. To address some of these challenges, MGN 664, the certification process for vessels using innovative technology, was published. This gives industry more assurance in the process that owners will need to go through in order to have their vessel approved by the UK administration. Although this is, and I hope industry colleagues will acknowledge this, is a step in the right direction, the certification of autonomous vessels and ensuring they are safe to operate within a busy marine environment is still challenging. However, we continue to listen, and we listen to feedback, and we are currently inviting comments to improve this process and update this MGM. Next slide, please. As well as introducing MGN 664, for vessels under 24 metres or less, the UK has been leading the way in the development of a national code that will support remotely operated unmanned vessels. This will form a part of the Workboat Code, a well-established code of practice for the safe operation of work and pilot boats. The updated Workboat Code will set out requirements for the innovative technologies such as battery hybrid and battery electric vessels, as well as for remotely operated unmanned vessels. This review and update has been developed over a 4-year period, and we are now reviewing consultation responses prior to its publication later this year. In developing the Boat Code, the UK administration has looked at ways in which it can adapt the existing frameworks in order to support the autonomous industry. One of the most significant changes that will be made will be the replacement of the existing statutory instrument with a new regulations that will enable the existing provisions to apply to remotely operated unmanned vessels as workboats. The Workboat Code has enabled the UK to look at what requirements can be removed or reduced on board a vessel that does not have persons on board. By taking this pragmatic approach, the ROUV Annex disapplies a range of requirements, including some associated with life-saving and fire appliances, crew accommodation and medical care. This is considered a common sense approach for a vessel that is not going to have people on board whilst at sea. To aid in the development of the annex, we have deliberately focused on unmanned operations in order to remove one level of regulatory complexity. However, the setting of requirements for the remote operations centres from which the ROUV is controlled has been challenging within the legal framework, as traditionally the Maritime Coastguard Agency has only needed to set requirements for the vessels and those on board. It has also been challenging to find the correct balance between ensuring the safety of sea users and allowing for the advantages that an ROUV can offer, but we believe we have found this balance. As you have heard, the UK is pursuing multiple strands of regulation in order to develop regulatory frameworks for the range of MASS that are being developed and that may wish to operate in UK waters. Each learns from the others as different sectors pose different challenges to us. It is complex and often frustrating work, both for us and the industry stakeholders we are working with. However, I'm confident that all involved are working towards the same goal, a safe, secure an operationally viable mass industry in the UK. The work of the Department of Transport, and in particular that of the Maritime and Coastguard Agency, does not solely focus on the regulation of mass, but also considers the impact that these vessels will have on the maritime environment and on other maritime users. This is an aspect of work that my colleagues in His Majesty's Coastguards are particularly interested in. As more autonomous vessels come online, there is a need to ensure that should an accident or incident occur, that those that operate in the Maritime Rescue Coordination Centres are aware of the advantages and disadvantages and limitations that an autonomous vessel may bring to such situations. To start this conversation, we ran a workshop to bring together interested stakeholders to discuss and compare the search and rescue capabilities of autonomous vessels versus that of a conventional ship. This was achieved through serious gaming that provided attendees with a range of scenarios that varied in location, incident, and environmental conditions, in which to compare the actions that could be expected from an autonomous vessel of differing degrees of autonomy in different SAR situations. The one-day workshop highlighted a number of practical, regulatory, and moral questions that will need to be addressed or taken into consideration as the UK legislation is further developed. Next slide, please. I'll now just take a couple of moments to share with you some of the findings of that workshop. The workshop attendees confirmed that autonomous vessels have the same obligation to respond to a distress call as a conventional ship. However, the actions and the role of a mass might play in a SAR situation would be dependent on the level of autonomy and on the capabilities of the vessel. The consensus was that an autonomous vessel with crew or passengers would be able to offer a higher level of assistance as they would have LSA on board, whereas a fully autonomous vessel was not likely to have such equipment. Seems quite obvious, really. The workshop found that the nearer inshore the incident, the less likely it was that a mass would be able to provide meaningful support in a SAR event, as other better equipped conventional vessels were likely to be able to respond and assist. But the scenarios found out that on the high seas, mass may have a more meaningful role to play, as other vessels may not be as readily available. However, it was acknowledged that the assistance an autonomous ship could offer would still be limited. The workshop identified the main role of an autonomous vessel as that of a communications relay, if no other assets were available on board. The use of images from autonomous vessels for situational awareness purposes was also discussed, although the access to this information and required bandwidth of such data was highlighted as being potentially restrictive. From this perspective, the role of a fully autonomous vessel in a search and rescue scenario was compared to that of an aircraft that may fly over an incident. The workshop also questioned whether fully autonomous vessels should carry LSA, even if it had nobody on board. This discussion raised a number of moral, technical, and legal questions that will need to be further explored. The role of autonomous ships as a communication relay raised questions regarding how coastguards would communicate with the remote operations centre where the vessel would be controlled from. This highlighted the potential need for a change in the information that may be required from an autonomous ship. For example, the sharing of land-based as well as maritime communication contact details. This discussion also made it apparent that those attending the workshop assumed that there would always be a human in the loop who would have oversight, and that this would be true for even a fully autonomous vessel. This discussion also raised questions as to whether vessels should be identified as being autonomous. If yes, how would this be done? Could an automatic identification system be used? And if such a system is used, what were the security risks around this? Finally, the workshop discussed how we can plan and work through the transition from conventional to autonomous ships, when the change in ratio may mean that there will come a point where there are fewer conventional ships with full life-saving capabilities available to respond to an incident. It was noted that this ratio is likely to change over time, but we questioned if SAR services are ready for this and if the data is being assessed to assess this transition. These questions bring us back full circle to the starting point of my presentation and the identification of gaps in our knowledge and understanding and in the regulatory framework when it comes to facilitating autonomous vessels. However, the workshop I've just described and events such as this show that industry and administrations are able to work together. And from my perspective, this is a situation that can only strengthen the development of the UK regulatory framework and increase the safety and security of the autonomous vessel industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very